This is a review for The Making of King Kong, the official guide to the motion picture, which is for the 2005 Peter Jackson remake. And this is a really excellent making of book. There's nothing special about it, it's very standard, but within that standard framework, it's far better than 90% of other making of books. It's got just tons of really informative text, lots of amazing behind the scenes photos, and so any negatives the book has, which it has a few of course, but those are more than made up for by how solid the majority of the book is. It reminds me a lot of The Lord of the Rings, the Making of the Movie trilogy book, which I've reviewed previously. And when I say it reminds me of that book, what I mean is it seems completely based on that book. Which isn't a bad thing, because that book was great too, but it is just an observation. Just everything from the style of the writing to the structure of the book feels very influenced by that Lord of the Rings making of book. So the way the book's styled and structured is like we're following the author around Weta Workshop and around the studio, getting a description of what she's seeing and then hearing one or two people in each department talk about some of the work they've done on the film. The focus is mostly on the more visually constructive departments, people who are creating stuff you can actually look at, art, visual effects, miniatures, set dressing, costumes, etc., as opposed to like music or cinematography and stuff, although there is a small section on Foley sound recording. And overall, the book covers a super impressive range of areas of the production, but it's certainly not a comprehensive story of the making of the film. The thing I complain about with every making of book ever written is that it always feels like there's never enough. I want every single thing covered in minute detail, and of course I know and accept that's simply not possible. But so many books just seem determined to waste whatever opportunity they do have with frivolous text and poor layout. Whereas this Kong book does a really good job of trying to make the most of what's possible for a making of book. And consequently, I came away feeling like I'd learned a hell of a lot more information about how the movie was made than I usually do with 90% of other books. This book does have a very typical brisk pace that makes some stuff feel a little jumpy or disjointed, even from paragraph to paragraph. And this is obviously because, like I said, like most other making of books, in trying to cover so much stuff in such limited space, each department does seem to fly by too quickly. Two ways this book attempts to make the most of this is, first of all, by having a decent page count. The book looks a lot shorter than it is because of the quality of the paper is very thin and magazine-like, which isn't good, but it has almost 250 pages, which is very impressive compared to most of these sort of books. And even though the layout of the book could have used some polishing, that page count is still a really good indicator of just how much content you're getting. The other way the book makes you feel like you're getting worthwhile information is that it does tend to stay very specific and detail focused. Not always, but mostly. So within each section on whatever department or area of the film is being discussed, you'll get maybe a handful of specific examples of how or why something was done. You know, a specific aspect of a specific prop or location or whatever. And although that means by focusing heavily on a couple of things, there are also a million other things that aren't covered with the same level of insight. I always prefer this method of the author, the cast, the crew, speaking about how or why a couple of things were done specifically and give me insightful information about that, rather than talking about things too generally and consequently giving me no real information at all. Occasionally the book does stray into that sort of territory, but never to the point of it being frustrating. Interestingly, the only part of the text I didn't like was the first 20 pages. There was just something about it that was a little awkward and made it feel like the book was going to be written more like those that are written like they're a sound-bitey publicity piece. So if you do pick this book up and happen to be put off by the beginning, don't worry, just stick with it to about 30 pages in when it really starts to kick into gear. I think one of the reasons I like this book is because of how I approached it and how I choose to view it, which is, if this were my only resource or the main resource I had for the making of this movie, I really don't know how I'd feel about it. Despite how much great content it has, I feel I'd probably still be left wanting more. However, the way I use this book is to supplement my main source, which is the behind-the-scenes stuff on the DVDs. And I think if you're a big fan of this movie, this will probably be your experience too. If for some reason you haven't seen the DVD stuff, then I can't recommend more highly that you do so. I only kind of like King Kong. I've only seen it twice, but I've watched the making of stuff on the DVDs 5 or 6 times the whole way through, and there must be like like more than 8 hours worth of stuff, from the production diary DVDs, the post-production diaries on the special edition, and then the commentary and other documentaries on the deluxe extended edition DVDs. If that sounds like a lot to keep track of, thankfully it's all available in one Ultimate Edition Blu-ray. All these DVD features were produced by Michael Pellerin, who also did the DVDs for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and this King Kong stuff is just as good, which is to say among the best making of behind the scenes content ever produced. And so by having the DVD as a really strong base, I kind of view this book as a companion to that, to fill in some gaps and give extra details not mentioned on the DVDs. However, one thing to definitely be aware of is that there is a fair amount of overlap between this book and the DVDs. In fact, some quotes are identical, which I don't know if that means the book is using the same source or if it's just the cast and crew giving their standard response to certain questions. Obviously, it's not the responsibility of any making of book or DVD to anticipate everything you may or may not have ever read or heard about the making of a movie, although I do often wish they could coordinate better, but overall there is more than enough information exclusive to this book. Speaking of which, the images are also incredible. I'd say only about 10% are stills and then another 10% for concept art, but the majority is really, really great behind the scenes photos and detail photography of sets and props that I haven't seen anywhere else. But even though I love the images, I'm less enthused by their layout, and this is my only real criticism of the book. The layout, the design, and the physical feel of the book, while not horrible, certainly had room for improvement. It very much feels like a product of its time. Back last decade, this was how most making of books looked. Even this size format was the standard, and they weren't very well designed, they were very cheap, hence my previous comment regarding the page quality. Whereas nowadays most making of books tend to be a bit more beautifully designed, hardcovers. The content hasn't really improved, but now they can charge you twice as much for it, and hopefully deceive you into thinking it's worth a 5-star review because it looks so pretty. But anyway, this book has a sort of Art Deco theme, which is nice, but it just feels like a Word template that someone's amateurishly dumped their pictures onto. Oh, and worst of all is the cover. Man, if ever there were a book to prove the wisdom of don't judge a book by its cover, this is it. A rule of thumb I like to use for judging covers is, if you couldn't read the title, how well does the cover visually convey what the book is about? And nothing about this cover says it's about the making of a movie. It doesn't even suggest King Kong to me. The image they used is fine as a concept art piece, just not as the cover for this book. Kong is one of the most iconic characters in fact, in cinema, and they could have used something with the Empire State Building, the V-Rex fight, Anne and Kong, the Beauty and the Beast love story, or even just Kong on his own, more close-up, a more powerful image. Whereas on this cover, he's like 2 inches tall and blurry and shadowy, surrounded by this kind of unappealing, blurry, muddied, undefined jungle and rocks, which don't offer any size comparison, so this gorilla on the front could just be a normal gorilla. How does this convey that this is the mighty 8th wonder of the world? And the back cover is even worse. Among the worst I've ever seen for a professionally published book. It's just a wall of text on this ugly, greeny grey background, no image, no style, nothing. I realize I've now derailed a really positive review by ending on a rant about something completely inconsequential, so please don't let anything I've just said about the cover and layout put you off the book. None of that stuff remotely matters when compared to how good the actual content is, and that's all that really counts. It's just I've been putting the finishing touches on 2 art books I have coming out next year, so I just have book design and covers on the brain. But anyway, The Making of King Kong. Definitely recommended to fans of the movie, or even just anyone who, like myself, who's a fan of Weta and Peter Jackson, all the incredible movie-making stuff those guys do. And if you're a fan of King Kong in general, there's a book called King Kong, The History of the Movie Icon, from Fay Wray to Peter Jackson. There are also multiple making-of books for the original movie and the 1976 remake, as well as an art and making-of book for the 2017 Kong Skull Island movie. I don't have experience with a lot of these books, but I thought I'd point them out even if I can't really recommend them one way or the other. One book I haven't read that I think sounds really cool is called Kong Unmade: The Lost Films of Skull Island. I think reading about movies that were planned but never made is so interesting, and I desperately wish there were more books on the subject. And then lastly, be sure to check out my previous review, which was on the sort of art book for this 2005 version called The World of Kong.